outside of Ford's Theater. But when they sent me to the Gettysburg speech site via a different device, this was via a time lab in East Hanover, New Jersey, that was using plasma confinement to send people to past events, I was dressed as a Union Bugle Boy. And when I tumbled through a set of wormholes to Gettysburg, they put me down on a road north of Gettysburg that was known to go south by southeast and then due south right into the heart of Gettysburg. So I popped into view there, and I immediately noticed that my Union Bugle Boy hat and both of my shoes and one of my socks had been pulled off in the process of getting there. And this was a process where they could insert you in a past event through a set of wormholes, and you were zipped all over the place. It was like really quite a riotous ride to get to the past location. But then when you were in that time-space location, you would get like this massive Kundalini effect, and you would just find yourself back in the plasma confinement chamber back in East Hanover. So we did one probe in that device, I did, to the Gettysburg speech site of November 19th, 1863. And I walked into town. I was told that the first time I crossed somebody on the road, I should ask them, I should say, "Hey, friend, which way Gettysburg?" And I did that with this tall, gaunt Union soldier who was walking by like he had, suffering from shell shock from the Battle of Gettysburg 4 months previously. And I yelled that to him, and he pointed his shoulders in one direction and gave this very officious, almost like a salute to me, like he pointed very officiously to the direction that Gettysburg was. And I said, "Thank you." But I took this remaining sock that I had on, I threw it in the bushes, because when I walked into Gettysburg, I didn't want to, we were always trained to avoid attracting attention. So I got into Gettysburg, and I was essentially accosted by this man in downtown who I've identified as the Gettysburg cobbler, John Lawrence Burns. I've actually identified him in an historical photograph as the man who accosted me as I was looking into what would have been called a millinery shop at that time. It was basically a men's clothing shop with things like hats, cravats, stick pins for cravats, canes, socks, shoes, and so forth. And he brought me in the shop, and he took me to the back of the shop, and he took these big brown civilian shoes off the wall and stuffed them full of packing paper and put the shoes on me, because my feet were naked at that point. I don't know if he gave me any socks. I don't think he gave me any socks. Then he took me to the back of the storeroom, where there were all these jackets, men's jackets on the floor, and he outfitted me in a Union Army parka, a winter jacket that was kind of like one of those cloth winter jackets from the 50s, where before down jackets were introduced with nylon fabric. It was sort of a cloth jacket with cotton batting inside.
Was this before traveling? Was this before traveling, or after you traveled they changed you?
Well, I had been outfitted at the East Hanover Time Lab. This woman named Valerie had outfitted me as a Union Bugle Boy, and I said, "Are you going to give me a bugle?" And she said, "No." And I said, "Why not?" She said, "Because you don't play the trumpet, you play saxophone, and I can't give you a saxophone because it's metal also, so you can't take a musical instrument through the the teleport." So she outfitted me with basically an historical simulation of a Union Bugle Boy jersey, pants, socks, and shoes with no metal in them. And again, there was one of these cloth belts that was kind of disguised under the jersey, and a hat. And like I said, when I was falling through these different wormholes to reach Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, on November 19th of 1863 from spring of 1972, my hat had been pulled off and lost in time-space, as had my two shoes and one of my socks. So I took the remaining sock off, threw it in the bushes, and walked into Gettysburg. By the time I got into town, I was shivering. I mean, my teeth were chattering uncontrollably, because it was a mid-November day, a couple days before Thanksgiving in Pennsylvania, and I was cold. And this guy saw me shivering, out looking into the stores, and he came limping up onto the wooden sidewalk and said, boy, what are you doing out in this cold weather without even any shoes on? You're going to catch your grip. apparently grip was the name for the flu during the Civil War period, which is I didn't know at the time. And he took me in the store and gave me these big, floppy, oversized men's shoes and a Union Army winter jacket. He then hobbled off to the Lincoln speech site, and then I hobbled after him, shuffling along in these big, oversized shoes. But when I got over there, awaiting Lincoln's arrival, I even saw my dad there, and I said, he was dressed as a farmer. And I said, Dad, what are you doing here? And he ignored me. And he later explained that on that probe to Gettysburg, he knew I was going to be in the project because he saw his youngest son at an older age there at Gettysburg that day. So he knew, oh God, it looks like my son Andrew is going to be part of the project. But my dad had been sent there on a previous jump at a previous time, dressed as a Pennsylvania farmer. He was from rural Pennsylvania, so I guess it was easy for him to pass in overalls. And so he didn't even answer me. He didn't even turn to the side and acknowledge my presence. I literally turned to him and said, Dad, what are you doing here? And he didn't even turn. Okay, so, but as I was standing there near the dais, Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address like on this dais that was about 100 feet wide and about 15 or 20 feet deep. About, 3 feet off the ground, I would say, with patriotic bunting around it, but nothing above it. There was no roof or canopy or anything. He was giving it in broad daylight. And I wanted to see it. Even though I was afraid of Abraham Lincoln, I was afraid because of that 1863 Alexander Gardner photograph of him where he looks like a chimpanzee, basically, a brooding chimpanzee, a menacing chimpanzee. I kind of was somewhat hesitant about watching Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address. I thought I might, pee my pants or something in excitement. But what ended up happening was that there were these two Union officers over at the corner of the dais. And one of them was this really manging-looking guy who was peeling an apple and eating it right in front of my face. And the other guy was this extremely handsome officer with a mustache who was sort of leaning against the corner of the dais, like the most handsome dandy in the Union Army. But the more mangy kind of mule skinner, kind of rough character really got in my face and started asking me a bunch of questions about why I wasn't with my regiment, what was my regiment. He said if I knew where my regiment was bivouacked, and I said, what does bivouac mean, sir? So I was really being caught up in the fact that the locals there were paying attention to me, and I really hadn't been trained with enough Civil War history to answer this guy's questions and not feel like I was immediately going to be arrested or something for being either a carpetbagger or a deserter. So what I did is I walked about 200 feet from the dais, and then because I was hoping nobody would notice my big oversized feet, I put my left foot forward, but my right foot cocked at a 90-degree angle. And that's where I was photographed at Gettysburg in what, until only a couple of months ago, was the only known photograph to capture an image of Abraham Lincoln at Gettysburg on November 19th of 1863 when he gave this famous speech there. In other words, the child in the foreground of that famous photograph where Lincoln was identified way in the back of the picture in a few pixels of either sitting down or standing up on the dais. I think it was when he was sitting down, because he still hadn't arrived on the dais when I walked away from it. I'm in. In other words, one of the first time travelers, namely myself from Project Pegasus in 1972, is depicted in the only known photograph of Lincoln at Gettysburg.
That's incredible.
So that kind of links, there are a number of data points to the Civil War. In fact, it's interesting how often the Civil War came up in the project. I think they were using it because it was a time of such social distress and dislocation that adults really wouldn't notice that there were children who had suddenly popped into view in some location. They would have thought that they were hallucinating because of the stress of the war. You think of a song like Hard Times by Stephen Foster, which he wrote in 1864 after the United States had already been in a civil war for 3 years. There was such stress and heartache and struggle during the Civil War period for most people that may explain why they were so frequently sending us to the Civil War. But in fact, the first chronovisor probe that I was